Have you ever had, like, one of those days, or maybe, let's be honest, one of those years, where you were just working harder than ever?
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there.
Right. Like you're crossing a million things off this endless to-do list, and your calendar looks like some brightly colored game of Tetris.
Yeah, it's totally overwhelming.
But then you finally close your laptop at the end of the day, and you feel like you've just been spinning your wheels in the mud. You know, you are exhausted. You are undeniably busy, but you aren't actually getting 1 inch closer to where you want to be.
It is the ultimate modern paradox, isn't it? I mean, we have more productivity tools, more apps, and, more hacks than any generation in human history.
Oh, for sure.
Yet we constantly feel like we are falling behind. We're doing way more, but accomplishing so much less of what actually matters.
Which is exactly the feeling we are tackling today. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission for this conversation is to step into the roles of expert educators and analytical storytellers, really. Because today's target is a massive titan in the self-improvement world.
Yeah, we are looking at The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan.
Exactly. So what is the absolute bottom line of this book right out of the gate?
Well, the book builds its entire foundation on a very specific claim. It argues that to achieve truly extraordinary results in your life, you have to ruthlessly subtract what it calls the trivial many.
Okay, subtract the trivial many.
Right, in order to focus exclusively on the essential few. And the whole mechanism it gives you to do this is something they call the focusing question.
Right, the focusing quest.
Yeah, the goal is to use this single question to align your grand ultimate life purpose with whatever tiny, mundane action you are about to take next. And that supposedly creates this unbroken sequential chain of success.
Okay, I mean, on the surface, I read that and think, sure, that sounds fantastic. It belongs on a motivational poster in a corporate break room.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
But we aren't here just to give you a cheerful summary of a bestseller. Our goal today is to deeply analyze the claims made in these pages, test the actual math they use, and find out what actually holds up in the messy reality of the real world.
Exactly. We want to know what works and what might just be incredibly well-marketed wishful thinking.
So to do that properly, we really need to start by looking at the causal connections the book tries to make. Because if a framework promises you extraordinary results, it has to prove how small actions compound over time.
Right, and this text relies incredibly heavily on mathematical and physical metaphors to make that case. So let's unpack the actual numbers they use to convince you.
The first one that jumps out, and it's a huge visual in the book, is the domino effect. The authors claim that a single 2-inch domino has enough potential energy to knock over another domino that is 50% larger than itself.
Yeah, so they are describing a geometric progression here. To break that math down simply, if you start with a 2-inch domino, the next one is 3 inches, the next is 4.5 inches, and, so on. The compounding effect of that math means that by the time you reach the 57th domino, it would theoretically be large enough to bridge the distance between the Earth and the Moon.
Which is a gorgeous, visually striking way to argue that success is sequential. You don't do everything at once. You line up your priorities, tip the first one, and let momentum do the
That's
rest.
the pitch, yeah.
But, okay, hold on, because my brain immediately throws a red flag here. In physics, if you want a domino sequence like that to work, you need a perfectly flat table, an absolutely flawless trajectory, and zero wind.
Yes, exactly.
The environment has to be completely controlled. Doesn't this mathematical model just assume that our lives take place in a frictionless vacuum?
That is phenomenal pushback, and it really gets to the heart of how we need to critically read this material. I would evaluate this domino claim as an exaggerated, albeit conceptually useful, metaphor.
So it's useful, but maybe a bit stretched.
Right. The underlying reasoning isn't entirely wrong. Small wins definitely build momentum. But the massive assumption here is that your career or your life's progression will be entirely unimpeded.
Which it never is.
Never. Real life has immense friction. Dominoes hit dead ends. A global pandemic scrambles your entire industry.
Or, a family member gets sick.
Exactly. It is a highly speculative model if you try to apply that rigid geometric math literally to the messy, unpredictable trajectory of the human life.
Well, if the physics metaphor feels a bit disconnected from reality, what about how the book handles time? Because they lean heavily on another famous numerical claim, the 10,000 hours to mastery.
Yes, this one was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell years ago, but it is utilized as a foundational pillar here. The book breaks this down mathematically for the reader.
What are the numbers they give?
They say that mastery requires 4 hours of deliberate practice every single day, 5 days a week for 10 straight years.
Wow. Think about that for a second. 4 hours a day, every day, for a decade. Are they really saying human skill acquisition is just a simple input-output machine? Like you put the quarters in, you get the mastery out?
That is exactly the massive assumption being made, and it's actually a widely known flaw in the 10,000-hour rule. It completely ignores innate talent, for one.
Right.
It also ignores the quality of the coaching you might be receiving. And perhaps most importantly, it ignores the fact that the landscape of a given field might completely transform over those 10 years.
Oh, that's a great point. Like, imagine spending 10 years doing 4 hours a day of deliberate practice coding in a programming language that becomes totally obsolete in year 9.
Precisely. Time spent does not automatically equate to mastery if the context around you changes.
Speaking of treating human beings like machines, let's talk about how the book approaches psychology, because they also throw out a highly specific number for habit formation. So claim number 3 in our analysis, habit formation, takes exactly 66 days.
Okay, this is one where we really have to look closely at the source data. I'd evaluate this claim as partially factual, but presented in a highly misleading way.
How so?
Well, it's based on a real study by a researcher named Philippa Lally, and she found that it took an average of 66 days for a new behavior to become automatic.
But, I mean, an average is just the middle ground of a spectrum, right?
Exactly. In that very same study, for some people, it took only 18 days to form the habit. For others, it took an exhausting 254 days.
Oh, wow, 254 days.
Yeah. So when a self-help text takes a wide statistical average and presents it to you, the reader, as an absolute hard and fast law, it creates a serious logical gap.
Right, because if you hit day 70 and you're still struggling, the book makes you feel like you failed.
Exactly. When in reality, your brain might just be on the 100-day track for that specific habit.
Okay, let's look at one more mathematical claim, because I think this one really illustrates the extreme nature of the book. Most of us are familiar with the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule.
Sure, the idea that 20% of your effort yields 80% of your results.
Right, but this book tells you to take that rule and narrow it all the way down to the vital 1%.
And the assumption embedded in that 1% rule is fascinating. It essentially assumes that every single task in your professional life can be perfectly quantified, isolated, and measured for its exact return on investment.
Which, okay, that makes sense. If I'm turning a specific wrench on a Ford assembly line, I can physically measure how many cars I helped build.
But try applying that to complex knowledge work. How do you quantify the ROI of a serendipitous brainstorming session with a colleague in the hallway?
You really can't.
Or how do you isolate the exact 1% value of building long-term trust with a client? In modern collaborative environments, expecting to neatly isolate it.
But since you and I don't live in a vacuum, what is actually stopping us from achieving this? To its credit, the book identifies several what it calls lies of success that derail our focus. So let's dig into the reasoning behind 2 of the biggest ones they present.
Sounds good. The first major lie the text dismantles is the concept of multitasking. The book claims that multitasking is a complete myth.
What's the reasoning there?
The reasoning provided is that the human brain simply cannot parallel process complex tasks. You aren't actually doing 2 things at once. Your brain is rapidly switching back and forth between them.
Okay, so think about your own workday for a second. You are deep into writing a complex proposal. Your phone buzzes with a Slack message from your boss. You pivot to read it. You type a quick reply, and then you look back at your screen.
Right, we do that all day.
And the sources here cite that you suffer a 25% to 100% loss of time just recovering from that tiny switch. Your brain basically has to undergo a costly cognitive reboot to remember where you left off.
And looking at the cognitive science behind this, I would evaluate this claim as completely factual and incredibly robust.
Oh, so this one holds up.
Absolutely. The biological cost of context switching is very real. Your prefrontal cortex has to disengage from the rules of the first task, activate the rules for the second task, and then reverse the entire process. When we try to multitask, we are essentially just doing 2 things poorly in rapid alternation. The book is spot on here.
Okay, I am fully on board with that. But then we get to the next lie regarding willpower, and things get a little strange.
Yeah.
The book claims that willpower is not a resource that is always on will call. They compare it to a smartphone battery that just drains as the day goes on.
Yeah, the underlying concept they're pointing to is decision fatigue. The reasoning is that as you resist temptations and make choices throughout the day, you burn through your brain's supply of glucose, lowering your cognitive capacity.
And they cite a study for this, right?
They do. To prove this, they cite a very famous study involving Israeli parole judges. The data showed that judges granted fewer and fewer paroles as the day wore on, allegedly because their mental energy battery was depleted from making high-stakes decisions all morning. So the actionable advice is, do your most important work early in the day when your battery is at 100%.
Okay, the mechanism of decision fatigue makes sense.
Yeah.
But to further back up this smartphone battery analogy, the book suddenly brings up the famous Stanford marshmallow experiment.
Right.
You know, the one they put a marshmallow in front of a preschooler and say, if you can wait 15 minutes without eating this, I'll give you a second one. But wait, isn't that experiment measuring something entirely different?
Yes, it is.
How does a kid's ability to wait for a second marshmallow prove that my brain battery runs out at 4 p.m.?
It doesn't. You've spotted a significant logical gap in the text's storytelling right there. The marshmallow experiment measures a personality trait known in psychology as delayed discounting, which is your ability to delay immediate gratification for a future reward. It is absolutely not a measure of a daily, exhaustible resource that drains like a smartphone battery.
So why include it at all?
Honestly, because it's an entertaining anecdote, and it highlights a structural flaw in how these types of books build their arguments.
A good story over good science.
Exactly. Sometimes a recognizable, compelling story is prioritized over logical consistency. The author wants to talk about resisting distraction, so they throw in the most famous study about resisting a marshmallow, even though it fundamentally misaligns with the specific mechanism they are trying to prove about decision fatigue.
Man, it makes you wonder if some of the foundational logic is a bit wobbly. How else do they attempt to prove these rules of success? Well, they point to history. They bring out the heavy hitters, Walt Disney, Albert Einstein, Bill Gates, to prove that success leaves clues.
Right. The argument here is that if you look closely at these monumental figures, each of them had one singular passion or one key person who elevated them to greatness.
Give me an example.
Well, the book points out that Walt Disney had his brother Roy to handle the messy business side. Einstein had a specific teenage mentor who gave him key books. Bill Gates had Paul Allen and one specific piece of foundational code.
But we have to look at this critically. Do those comparisons actually hold water, or is this just cherry-picking history to fit a narrative?
The massive limitation here is a classic case of survivor bias.
Ah, survivor bias.
Yes. Survivor bias is when we focus entirely on the people who survived or succeeded, and we just ignore all the people who did the exact same things but failed, because history doesn't record the losers.
Right.
So the comparisons the book makes are overly reductionist. It attempts to prove that a wildly complex, multivariable success story, like the building of the Microsoft empire or the revolution of quantum physics, can be boiled down to a single, neat, isolated element.
Right, like did Bill Gates benefit from having Paul Allen? Obviously. But he also benefited from an incredibly rare confluence of socioeconomic advantages, access to rare mainframe computers in the 1960s, perfect market timing, and honestly, an enormous amount of luck.
Yeah, exactly. Telling a reader, just find your one person or your one passion and you'll be the next Disney, is an unsupported oversimplification of how the world actually works.
Which brings us to another major comparison, or perhaps a contrast, that the book makes regarding the modern Holy Grail, work-life balance. Now, the authors are pretty blunt here. They basically admit that a perfectly balanced life is a total myth.
Yes, they argue that if you are genuinely seeking extraordinary results, you cannot be balanced. If you are dedicating extreme focus to your one thing, by definition, you are taking time away from everything else.
So to solve this, they offer an alternative perspective called counterbalancing.
Right, counterbalancing.
The concept is that you go long out of balance at work, meaning you obsessively focus on your one thing, ignoring other projects and emails for long, extended stretches. But to save your personal life, you go short, out of balance at home. You constantly check in with your spouse or kids in short bursts so you don't completely ruin your relationships.
And this is where we have to heavily evaluate the practicality of this advice. There is a critique in our sources from an analyst named Niels Bohrman that completely tears into this idea.
Oh, really? What does he say?
We need to look at how profoundly unrealistic this counterbalancing act is for the average person. Because to execute this, the book explicitly tells you to time block 4 completely uninterrupted hours every single day for your one thing.
Okay, let's put ourselves in your shoes as the listener. Imagine you are working a standard corporate 9 to 5 job. Tomorrow morning, you walk into your boss's office and say, "Hey, just a heads up, I'm going into an isolation bunker for 4 hours every morning to work on my singular passion project. Don't ping me, don't email me, don't invite me to meetings."
Yeah, good luck with that.
Right. You aren't going to suddenly become highly productive. You are going to become unemployed.
That is the fatal flaw in the assumption. The entire concept of the 4-hour time block relies entirely on the premise that you have complete entrepreneurial control over your own schedule.
Which most people don't.
Exactly. For the average employee, the cost of extreme focus cannot be paid at the office. Your boss demands your availability. So where do those 4 hours of deep focus come from?
It has to come from their private life. Early mornings, late nights, weekends.
Precisely. The idea that you can just go short at home while draining all your energy at work is highly speculative and potentially very damaging. The reality is that for most people, attempting this framework means the cost of their ambition falls entirely on their families, their sleep, and their personal health.
Which perfectly leads us into the core contradiction of the entire philosophy. Because this clash between the demand for extreme, radical focus and the unavoidable friction of daily life forces the book to make a massive structural pivot.
Let's trace the logical through line we've established so far. For the first half of the book, it preaches radical single-mindedness, the absolute exclusion of all else, the 1%.
But then you turn a page later in the book, and suddenly it tells you to apply the focusing question to 7 different life buckets.
Oh, yeah.
It wants you to ask the question for your spiritual life, your physical health, your personal life, your key relationships, your job, your business, and your finances. Oh, and it also kindly suggests adopting a complex 5-step morning routine consisting of meditation, eating a nutritious breakfast, exercising, spending time with family, and calendar planning, all before you even sit down to start your work.
Do you see the gaping logical hole here?
Yes. If I am diligently executing a 5-step morning routine and I am actively juggling goals across 7 different life buckets, haven't I just completely reinvented multitasking? Hasn't the book just watered down its own core radical message?
Absolutely. It is a glaring, undeniable contradiction. But if we analyze why the author structured it this way, it actually makes total sense as a publishing and business move.
How so?
Well, true, radical single-mindedness, the kind actually required to be an Olympic athlete or a tech billionaire, is terrifying to the average reader. It requires sacrificing almost everything else you care about.
Yeah.
If a book tells you to abandon your family to build a business, no one is going to buy it.
Yeah, that's not going to be a bestseller.
Right. So to make the philosophy palatable to the masses, the authors had to soften the blow. They quietly reintroduced the very balance they criticized, hiding it under the new labels of counterbalancing and life buckets.
But, to be fair to the authors, we have to look at an alternative perspective presented much later in the sources. Co-author Jay Papasan actually offered a clarification on this contradiction.
Yes, he did.
He stated that the one thing is actually a purpose book, disguised as a productivity book.
That is a crucial pivot. He introduces the iceberg model to explain the true mechanism at work here. Productivity, the time blocking, the morning routines is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the visible part above the water.
Right.
But beneath the surface, supporting it, is priority. And at the massive, unseen base of the entire iceberg is purpose.
Our sources use an amazing analogy from the psychologist Jonathan Haidt to explain this dynamic, and I want to spend a minute here because it's so powerful. Imagine you are a small human writer sitting on top of a massive 6-ton elephant. The writer represents your logical, analytical brain. It's the part of you that buys productivity books, color codes your calendar, and sets an alarm for 5 a.m. But the elephant you are sitting on represents your emotional heart, your subconscious, your true purpose.
What is so fascinating about that analogy is the causality of power. If the writer pulls the reins and says, hey, we need to go left to do our 4-hour time block, but the elephant sees a peanut to the right and wants to go right, where are you going?
You are going right.
You are going right. The logical writer has absolutely zero chance against the emotional elephant.
It completely reframes the problem. You cannot hack your way to productivity if your underlying purpose is fundamentally misaligned. If you are working harder than ever trying all these tips and tricks, but you still feel miserable and stuck, you don't have a time management problem, you have a purpose problem.
Exactly.
You're trying to desperately steer an elephant that simply doesn't want to go where you were pointing it.
And tying this back to the broader picture, this explains exactly why so many people fail at the 4-hour time blocks. They are trying to impose radical productivity on top of a career or a priority they don't actually care deeply about. The true mechanism of action is this. Purpose drives priority, and priority drives productivity, not the other way around.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground here. Let's bring this all together for a balanced conclusion. If we strip away the marketing, what are the core takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, the undeniable truth at the center of the book is that focus does create power. The most convincing and robust elements are the thorough dismantling of the multitasking myth, which, as we said, is backed by real cognitive science,
Yeah.
and the framework they call goal setting to the now. That's the process of reverse engineering your actions by working backward from a grand someday goal down to a 5-year goal down to what you must do right now. That is an incredibly practical way to find clarity.
But, as we've analyzed, there are significant parts that are doubtful, unverified, or just flat-out contradictory. The romanticized 4-hour deep work block is completely unrealistic for standard 9-to-5 employees without sacrificing their personal lives.
Right.
The overly neat, frictionless math of the domino effect doesn't survive the friction of reality. And the 7 life buckets directly contradict the entire premise of radical, singular focus.
So, realistically, the best way to utilize this material is to take their focusing question. What is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And use it as a daily compass to cut through the noise of your inbox.
A compass, yeah.
But you must treat the rigid time-blocking rules and the geometric math as ideals to strive for, not as a daily straitjacket to punish yourself with when real life inevitably gets in the way.
I think that is the perfect, healthiest way to look at it. A compass to guide you, not a straitjacket to restrict you. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to carry into your week.
What is it?
Well, the book constantly pressures you to define your ultimate one thing for your entire life, as if you were only allowed one massive domino. But considering the ever-shifting seasons of life we go through, the unavoidable friction of the real world, and the very real limits of our daily cognitive load, perhaps the better, more urgent question for you to ask yourself is this. What is your one thing for this exact season of your life right now?
That's a great reframing.
And perhaps more importantly, who or what are you willing to actively, consciously disappoint in order to achieve it? Because if you are trying to keep every single domino standing at once, you might just find yourself right back where we started, exhausted, undeniably busy, and just spinning your wheels.